Welcome to the Point. This past week, just as lawmakers were about to take a 2-week break, there was a breakthrough on spending some of the billions of dollars at the state's disposal, courtesy of the federal government. Money is all part of the COVID relief packages, first from the Biden administration and the Trump administration before that. Over the next 2 weeks, we'll get a breakdown of how some of that money will be spent and get a perspective from both sides of the aisle on how this broadly bipartisan plan will be implemented. This week, Republican Senator Eric Nesbitt gives us his take on a nearly $5 billion supplemental bill that he voted in favor of. Senator, momentous, I think, is what the Appropriations Chair in the Senate called this legislation that spends, I think, somewhere around $4.8 billion, mostly federal one-time money. And it has really been a point of a lot of conversation. I would point out, I think, some really sober conversation among members about what to do, how to use this money, how to get it right, because you're not going to get that chance again. Now it has been passed. Give me your take on the approach, the appropriateness, and what you think this could mean for the state of Michigan.
Yeah, so first off, that you're right, about 85% of what was passed is federal money that if we didn't spend it, it'd go to other states in terms of how the administration and Congress wrote the language of the law. And so it is real difficult times that are out there with people, uncertainty about the future, inflation that's happening, supply chain issues that's going on. And so there is some of that international uncertainty also with the war going on in Ukraine. So what does that mean for Michigan in the long term? And so I think the governor's original proposals and the budget that she introduced a month and a half ago, she wanted to spend every dime of state resources, every dime of federal monies, and put it out there as part of her reelection campaign for this year. So let's hold on, let's take a look at what our priorities are here in Michigan. And I've been saying all along that if you're going to spend any of this money, that it should be one-time capital-intensive projects, and that means real infrastructure such as water, wastewater, clean that up, such as roads and bridges, broadband, fiber, natural gas development, dams, etc. And so this is something where I think is we've worked through this process is that the legislature didn't get everything they wanted. The governor definitely didn't get everything she wanted because she wanted it more to be spent on growing the size and scope of government instead of investing in hard infrastructure, steel, concrete, stuff that's going to be around for 30 years, 40 years. Or a dam, such as what happened in Midland and Gladwin counties 2 years ago. You're talking hundreds of millions of dollars of destruction, trying to build back up that the dam capacity and making sure that there's safety for the residents there. And so that's going to be fixed, improved dam quality is going to be fixed, along with water and wastewater infrastructure, that $2 billion of that's going towards for municipalities to clean up their water and to make sure that we have a modernized water and to keep our water clean. And this is something where it's not going to be spent this year or next year. It is several years that you're building up this fund. And so we can work through these supply chain issues and these inflation issues, but it's something where when you invest in underground infrastructure like water and wastewater, it's usually there for 60, 70 years. And that's going to be both debt avoidance and tax avoidance in the future if we're able to improve that kind of infrastructure.
One of the problems is, speaking specifically to the water infrastructure, is that some of it's been in the ground more than 60 or 70 years in some cases, and we've seen the manifestation of that in Flint certainly and in Benton Harbor. But it's not just those two places. I mean, this is really something that can be utilized in a whole lot of the older cities in the state. I mean, this is, if you look at those two places, not to minimize them, but that may be just the tip of the iceberg.
Yeah, I mean, Benton Harbor got $45 million to replace all their lead lines and to upgrade some of their system, but the overall package includes applications for all municipalities in the state, public and private entities, and even sewer lines to upgrade those to try to protect our water and waterways. I mean, we're the Great Lakes state. We have over 12,000 bodies of water here in the state of Michigan. Let's keep it clean. Let's upgrade it instead of just spending it on, growing the size of government and the number of employees. Let's invest it in actual real infrastructure. And you see that with some of the other things, such as the parks. There's about $250 million of backlog in our state park system. We've seen an increase in usage of those parks. And instead of just dumping a lot of money into it this year, we grow the State Parks Trust Fund, which is now $300 million. We grow that to $800 million. And so the investments from that are then able to use to keep the parks going for decades to come. And that can avoid any future tax increase or other things to make sure that our parks are maintained. And there's also some funds for local, municipal, and county parks. But one of the things in Grand Rapids I know like Senator Huizenga fought for and was able to get done was the waterway transformation project downtown, trying to work to make sure that the Grand River on the banks is upgraded, that you're able to have walkable trails all the way by it, and then also be able to invest in both commercial and residential properties to really transform the city to a more walkable city and to connect it to the rest of the county trails. And that's something where 2/3 of the money is going to be coming from the local, philanthropic, foundational support, and 1/3 is going to be coming from the state, but it's one-time transformational money where you're making Grand Rapids go to that next level of investment. And I just salute Senator Huizenga for taking the lead of that on the Senate and making sure that gets done.
One of the things that I have heard any number of your colleagues say, and by the way, on both sides of the aisle, I haven't spoken to every single member, but one of the things that you've been talking about, and I just want to bring this to a little finer point, is that you didn't want the money that you spent now to obligate the state to spend more later. And is that what you feel like you've accomplished here?
Yeah, I think as you look at it, some of the funds that were put in this special budget supplemental are ones that we had to spend on certain projects that the federal government says for certain areas, and then other ones are just a one-time grant program, or you reload some of these longer-term foundational, pieces. And so it's something where Senator Bumstead, who's a solid conservative member out of Muskegon, he's somebody that's taken the lead on the water and wastewater side, and I know it's something where he knows the importance of keeping the Great Lakes clean, having represented Muskegon and up north end, Oceana County. And as part of that is that if we're able to upgrade some of these 60, 70-year-old pipes, then we don't have to worry about them for another 60 or 70 years. And usually when you go in and replace those pipes, you replace the road up on top also. And being able to do some transformational projects, like I mentioned, the one in Grand Rapids, and there's also hundreds of acres that can be developed around the Muskegon Lake. And I know Senator Bumstead's worked to make sure that there's some resources there to clean up some of the contamination, the PFAS contamination, and other sites of these old industrial sites to transform it, modernize it to allow for residential and commercial investment, which could be largely transformational in Muskegon. And Senator Bumstead's been a great advocate for the Muskegon community on this bill.
One of the things that I think would be true in your district and a lot of rural districts, and it was exacerbated, or at least it was highly noticeable during the pandemic, and that is a lot of folks don't have broadband. And I know that this bill is not likely to solve that problem, but there is money in here to at least get some of the infrastructure part of that done. Is that going to be something that will make a noticeable difference? Is there enough for that?
Yeah, I'm disappointed that the governor vetoed my broadband bill a year ago. It's something that Representative Griffin and myself and worked with Representative Whiteford on getting passed out of the House and the Senate, sent to the governor's desk, saying that unserved areas that they would get a relief on their local property tax by extending personal property tax by extending to unserved areas at least speeds of 100 megabits, so a high-speed internet. This is something where local broadband providers such as Bloomingdale Communications, Great Lakes, Midwest Energy have all said this is the number one impediment of trying to connect those unserved areas. She vetoed those bills twice. The governor vetoed these bills twice, and it was unfortunate that Governor Whitmer hasn't shown more leadership on actually connecting our rural areas to broadband. As part of this legislation we passed this last week, that includes $250 million of federal dollars for broadband. We tried our best to specifically target it to unserved areas and rural communities. Unfortunately, the governor kept on trying to steer it back to some of the urban areas to double build some of these networks. I think we were effective in the language to put the bumpers and do it where there's actually the need for real broadband, where you had, as you mentioned during COVID, you had families driving to McDonald's to be able to upload homework. You had school bus drivers driving out homework packets because they didn't have access on their hotspots or on, or access to internet back home. And so this is a real issue that continues to be an issue, and I hope the governor works with the legislature to actually get serious on investing and growing in broadband. And we keep on putting ideas out there, and it's unfortunate the governor only wants to use, government-run, programs instead of trying to challenge the private sector to finish connecting the rest of the state.
When we come back, we talk about how a legislature and governor who have not had a great track record when it comes to almost anything were able to agree on this massive spending bill, how the upcoming elections will impact the budget process, and we'll get some pushback from the senator when we ask about how you pay for tax cuts. He's got an answer. Next, To the Point. Welcome back to the Point. For the governor and the legislature, coming up with the supplemental agreed to this past week was a major achievement, particularly given the history of both sides having sometimes a very different view of government. The next big test will be getting a budget done in time for legislators and the governor to hit the campaign trail in advance of what will be a major election cycle. We continue our conversation with Senator Eric Nesbitt. I want to talk to you about the process, because here we are, not even April yet. And this $4.8 billion, as you say, I think about 85% is that one-time federal money, has been passed by the House, passed by the Senate. The governor, as you and I are speaking, has indicated she will sign it. Probably gets to that early next week, I'm guessing, whenever those bills get to her. I would not have made a prediction that this legislature and this governor would be able to come to an agreement in a I know you've been talking about it for a long time, but it's still a relatively short period of time to pull this all together, particularly given the unusual economic conditions of the state of Michigan and the fact that it's an unusual election cycle because everybody who's running is running in a new district. I mean, it's part of their old district perhaps, but it's all new out there and everybody's up. What was the process like? Was I just not watching closely enough? Should I have been surprised?
Well, last year in June, the Senate passed, legislation that would bundle every critical condition bridge in the state of Michigan and bid it out, both local bridges and state bridges, and get all critical condition bridges back up to good condition. We passed that last year. Last year, we also passed the water supplementals, with a lot that was in there in water and wastewater as part of Senate Republican plan to actually invest in steel and construction projects and real infrastructure here in the state. And then also we had a state parks and local parks legislation. So this is all stuff we've been discussing and been introducing over the last year. But it's something where the governor wants to spend it all at once and just get it out the door. And I think it's about prioritizing. And how do you work to prioritize to make sure that this is going to long-term steel and concrete in the ground projects to try to avoid debt and any tax increases in the future. And I think that's something we're mostly did with this legislation. Is it perfect? No, it's not. We had to negotiate with the governor and we had to negotiate with with others. But I think we got to a better better spot than where the governor started off with. And it's something where I think longer term, this is stuff where it's not all going to be spent this year. It's going to be a multi-year process that's there.
But I guess my question is, how did you get there? Because since the very first budget process, which was very difficult for this governor in divided government, going into the COVID regulations that the Republicans in the House and Senate fought with the governor on an almost daily basis. Then when all of this money was made available, the same arguments that you just talked about, there were very big differences of opinion in how this money was going to be spent. Yet here we are and you've gotten there, so something happened. You were able to reach an accommodation and agreement somehow with this governor because, as I said, she's already indicated she's going to sign it. So I mean, how did that come about in what I would see almost against type to be able to get something this big put together that quickly.
Yeah, I think it was partially is that we wanted to make sure that there was money for dams, water, wastewater projects, making sure that there was hard infrastructure on bridges and parks. And it was something where the governor wanted some of the federal dollars to be spent on some of these housing assistance and housing investments, which again, the federal dollars we have to still appropriate for them to be spent. But it was something where we took some of the priorities that she had, and we made sure that I think we got a pretty good win for the taxpayers here in the state of Michigan, and made sure that they went to one-time capital-intensive, products. And it's something where I think the governor also sees politically the challenge that she has for all of her shutdowns and the way she introduced her first budget 3 years ago, where the Governor Whitmer wanted a 45-cent per gallon gas tax increase. We said no, that's not going to happen. When Governor Whitmer wanted 40% increase in the small business tax in her first budget, we said no, that's not going to happen. And so we did get auto no-fault reform done 3 years ago, which people are getting the $400 checks now and seeing some savings from the auto insurance reform that both the House and Senate Republicans took the lead on, and we finally forced her hand on that. And then you're right in terms of the budget. She vetoed 100. The first budget we worked with her, we delivered to her desk. She vetoed 147 different line items, including $400 million more for roads without a tax increase. So there's a long history of us having to save her from herself, and that's something where I think, whether it's been the gas tax or other things, I can only imagine the price of gasoline right now if her 45-cent per gallon gas tax increase would have went through 3 years ago. But fortunately for the Republican legislature, we stopped those kind of massive tax increases. Now it's disappointing that the governor vetoed my own bill last week, where I passed through a tax cut that would have provided lower taxes for seniors, a $500 per child tax credit for families, and lower income taxes for all working individuals and working families in the state of Michigan. And the governor vetoed that bill. And it's disappointing that she wants to figure out how to spend every last dime of both the state surplus, where we're running about a $8 billion state surplus right now, and every dime of the federal dollars right away. And I think we need to make sure we do this in a thoughtful approach that grows the economy, invests in our roads and bridges, and something where Michigan can be more competitive in the long term.
Well, let's talk about competitive, because there is a competitive election coming up. And before you can get there, you and your colleagues need to strike an accommodation one more time with the governor, because you need to get a budget done. Now, as you just pointed out, there are a lot of state revenues out there that are available for appropriators to take a look at. And because of that, I anticipate this will be the largest ever budget that will be passed by the state of Michigan. We'll wait and see what the final dollar figure is. How much time, and this is just a guess, how much time do you have to put that together before the elections start to really encroach? I know there's a July 1st statutory deadline that has not always or ever been met, I believe, since it was passed. Except
we passed it for 8 years under Governor Snyder.
Well, but there was no.
There wasn't the statute in place.
That's right.
We just took care of it.
That's right.
Because there was a proper accounting that needed to be done.
And that's exactly right. But
yeah.
But the statute, from the time it's been put in place, is not. You haven't hit that mark. So there's a lot of money. There are a lot of elections, and a lot of people want to go out and start knocking on doors and doing some of that kind of thing because they want to come back and do this all again. So how much time do you have realistically to get that budget put together? Forgetting for a moment about that statutory part.
I think you're going to see appropriations committees start working on or they've already started working on the individual budgets. I think these budgets you'll see introduced probably near the end of April, passed out of the committee end of April, beginning of May. Both the House and Senate will likely see a larger budgets passed in mid-May. And we'll see whether the governor is willing to negotiate and actually prioritize the taxpayers in Michigan over just government spending. I think it's okay not to spend everything on the books. I think it's okay to put some more money in the rainy day fund. I think it's important and good to return some money to the taxpayers here in Michigan that actually earned and worked it, especially with the amount of inflation we're seeing from the untold number of trillions of dollars of spending from Washington, D.C. and the federal government. And I think it's okay to pay down some of this long-term debt. I think it needs to be a priority. And so it depends on those are going to be the priorities, I think, as Republicans in the House and Senate work on this budget, is trying to pay down debt, invest in long-term needs in the state, roads, bridges, water, wastewater, dams, and also put some money away for savings and pay down some long-term debt. And those are going to be the priorities that are there. And my hope is that we can get an actual tax cut for all Michiganders, instead of what the governor's been trying to do is say, no, only if you buy an electric car you can get a tax cut. Only if you do these certain activities you can get a tax cut. Only if your income's a certain type of income when you retire, instead of all retirement income. And I think that's the challenge that we have, is to stand up for all Michiganders, all working families, instead of just those chosen constituencies, Democrat constituencies that the governor wants to stand up for.
Well, what does that look like? Because we know that the governor has already said no to rolling the income tax back to 3.9. She doesn't like the idea of pausing the 27-cent use tax, even though Republicans had promised that they would put something like $725 million backfill to make up that difference with some of perhaps this money that has been allocated now. She wants to pause the sales tax. Republicans have not been particularly wild about that idea. Yet it seems likely.
I introduced the bill to repeal the sales and use tax on gasoline.
And I'm talking about the sales tax, 6% sales tax.
On gasoline, yeah. I dropped that bill last week.
But you wanted it repealed permanently, right?
No, well, yeah, the sales tax, on gasoline, we're one of only a few states that has a sales tax on gasoline. But you're right, she vetoed we voted on a 6-month holiday on the gas tax, 27 cents per gallon, and she called on the federal government to do a holiday on the 19 cents per gallon federal gas tax. When asked would she do that on the state gas tax, and she said no, that we passed it, and she vetoed that. But then, as a follow-up last week with Senator Barrett and myself and Senator Lowers, we introduced legislation that would repeal the sales and use tax. So that's on gasoline, which we're one of only about a dozen states that has a sales tax on gasoline, which means the more expensive oil and gas gets, those working families that are trying to get to church and school and work have to pay that much more. And I think that's just wrong. And so I'd like to see 100% of the taxes collected at the pump actually go to roads and bridges, instead of to the general fund or other areas that the sales tax goes to.
Remarkably, we're running out of time, but what do you do when you lose that sales tax if you repeal it permanently, the 6% on gasoline? What do you do to make up those funds?
We have billions and billions. We have an $8 billion surplus, Rick. We have a huge surplus.
But that's this year.
No, but that's long. Right now, the ongoing surplus they're saying is $1 billion. But you can lock some of that away to make sure it's taken care of the next few years. If the government can't live on as much as they bring in, then we have a real problem. And that's something where working families in Michigan do that every day. They live on their own budgets. And they have to deal with this inflation that's going on. They have to do this with the supply chain issues that's going on. There's no reason that some of these hardworking taxpayer dollars can't stay in the pockets of the taxpayers and hardworking families. And so that means we can spend a little less and they can save a little more, or actually, pay to get their, fill up their car and get to work.
We're back with a final thought to the point. That statutory deadline for budgets being done is July 1st, and there is some optimism, particularly given what we saw this last week, that the legislature and governor will find enough common ground quickly enough to make that happen. We'll be here watching To the Point.